Oh, good afternoon. I'm delighted to invite you to join us for the History of Entrepreneurship Education in the United Kingdom. It's EEUK seminar. We're just welcoming colleagues into the room, so thank you for joining us, and looking forward to sharing with you an overview of our kind of history, actually taking the time to step back in order to step forward. So we're very excited. I'm Alison. I'm joined today by our president, Dave, who is Dave Bolton, who's joining us from Swansea. I'm just going to ask him to wave because he's not well. I don't know if you just want to say hello, Dave. But
Hi everybody. Dave Bolton here. Most of you will know me. I've seen some some names coming through, which is great. Just like to, on behalf of the UK, thank Luke, Colette, David, and John for their input into this. I know it's going to be a fantastic event, so thank you to them, and look forward to catching up with you all soon. Thank you all.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave. So Dave, as president, has opened the event, and we will be bringing in our speakers to talk to you about the history, the lived experience. Our kind of focus for today is to learn about the experience that we've had in the UK, which initially was always compared to the US, and were we doing enough, and all kind of lots of comparative understanding of our work. But I think we've got a lot to learn and also a lot to share, and also a huge challenge ahead. So I know the focus from our speakers is also in terms of how the approaches can take us forward, and actually what does it mean in terms of going forward. So I think there's a bit of a message for us in terms of the challenges ahead. So we thank you for joining us to kind of take a step backwards in order to move forward. So thank you. I know you've joined because of the speakers. It's not often that we get 4 professors in the room. I'm utterly delighted to have them all with us from, as I said, from America and from across the UK. We've got Colette in Dundalk, so we're like really bringing in a range of historical perspectives and a vast amount of literature in order to bring you this perspective. I think Luke is going to be doing our chairing for us, and will actually be hosting it as a panel presentation, but we will be seeking questions from you, and we welcome that. So you have an opportunity to make a question. If you want to do a queue in the chat, we'll be picking those up if there's something that occurs to you while colleagues are speaking. And at the end, we'll be taking questions. And if you wish to unmute, you will be recorded, but you will be able to speak and ask your question. So thank you very much for your interaction and your thoughtful questions in the chat as we go. As I said, I'm utterly delighted to have such a powerhouse of a panel to introduce to you, and I'm not going to pick out their highlights. You can see, and that's, I know why you signed up, because of the fantastic lineup we have, and the kind of brain power that came together in this piece of work is evident. But I do want to make a small advert for EUK, but also make the connections across that. Actually, we're delighted, those of you that were at IEC that we had last year will recognise David and John from actually speaking and bringing this topic to life for us in the first place. But IEC is actually something that connects all of our speakers, because I know Colette has just been announced as one of our keynotes for our conference in Belfast in September. So we are going to have a small advert where we encourage you to come, put a date in your diary. And Luke, you're not forgotten. I did dig in the archives, and I think you are down as being at the second IEC, which was in Cambridge. So you also have a long history of sharing and supporting IEC and the work that we all do.
And I should plug for myself as well. I was the keynote in 2014 in Newcastle, where I did my PhD, which was very good.
Brilliant, thank you. You see, so there's a thread, so I could pick out some fantastic elements from all of our speakers, but I don't want to eat into the time. I do want to bring Luke in actually to host this for me, and host his colleagues in their in-depth deep dive. But just thank you for joining us, and yeah, we're really delighted that you can all be here with us. So I think colleagues have mainly arrived. So with that, and no further ado, I'll invite Luke to take the floor.
Great, thank you very much. So really, we have a sort of a year-long project here on the history of entrepreneurship education in the UK, and really trying to look back into the past in order to really think about where we go in the future for entrepreneurship education. And so it's been a real delight to work with Colette, David, and John on this. And the paper is close to being published. It'll be coming out hopefully in Organisation and Management History. And a quick plug there, they are doing a special issue for the history of entrepreneurship education. And I do know there's a French paper, there's a Spanish paper. I think there's some Scandinavian colleges that have a paper in there. So there's going to be a very interesting special issue coming out soon on the history of entrepreneurship education. And you can get this, the extended piece that we've written as an EEUK working paper. We are here to try to encourage you to read it. As we present and developed some of these seminars, we're very aware of quite how complicated and detailed our history is. And so it's harder to present than it is to read, is our quick summary on the work. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so we have two sections really. The first section is just going over the paper and the history of entrepreneurship education in the UK. And I'll introduce the purpose, methodology, and approach of the paper quickly. We'll provide some deeper kind of typifications of what we're calling proto-EE education, entrepreneurship education. So things that were really important early on in the UK's history that played a role later in entrepreneurship education and its development. And then we'll talk about some of the particular stages of entrepreneurship education in the UK, their typifications, and then explain how we build those into 4 different typificatory schemes. So the key here is that we're taking what would we describe as a social constructionist approach, trying to think about, well, the lived experience and the way in which language is being used to construct different ways of thinking about entrepreneurship education over its history, and specifically within the UK. And then we will have a Q&A section, and then we will switch into the last half an hour. We're going to talk about what's next, and David will lead that. And specifically, we're talking about harmonious entrepreneurship education, which he will talk about. But we will have an open discussion at the end there as well. Okay, so next slide. Okay, yeah. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so I just wanted to just flag up that we started this with Alan Gibb many years ago. Alan had collected a large documentary library of items from entrepreneurship education and its history. And so Alan was key to the beginning of this. Myself and Alan and John started to work on this some years ago. Didn't quite, as we were working on it, we were realizing how sort of complicated and overwhelming it was, and didn't really progress it. And unfortunately, Alan passed before we had a chance to progress it. We then had the opportunity of this special issue and restarted the work and invited John and Colette to join us to ensure that we were doing a good job. So the purpose of this work is really to document the UK's EE history. We recognize that the American history of entrepreneurship education was well documented, but really we hadn't done that in the United Kingdom. We wanted to, there are a number of studies out there on research, on policy, on certain periods and stages where, for example, the NCG and others had done reviews of what was going on at certain points in time, but these hadn't been pulled together into one holistic view of the progress of entrepreneurship education in the UK, and we wanted to do that. We wanted to provide a counterbalance to the US historical perspective. Everything seems to claim that entrepreneurship education started in the US and basically colonized the rest of the world. I think there's some different perspectives that one can put forward there. And there's a group of researchers that are becoming interested in history in entrepreneurship education that are taking a deeper perspective. A really good paper in Academy of Management Learning and Education that rethinks the US history of entrepreneurship education and provides a German counterpoint as well. And then we wanted to provide a platform for thinking about how we develop entrepreneurship education going forwards, and what had really been the drivers behind it in the past, and how might we understand these drivers in a way that we might be able to, as educators, have more influence over how it develops in the future. Okay, next slide. So hopefully you can see this. Just a quick overview of the methodology. We started off with correspondence between Alan, John, Ron Downing, and myself. Then a significant literature survey was undertaken. We then formed a team to take to the next stage. So that was where Colette and David joined the team. We collected reviews, reports, policy documents, got a first draft chronology of EE's history. Then we shared that chronology and an initial kind of ideas with a group of primary sources. So there's basically 16 people provided feedback. So you can imagine this, if anybody's written a paper, you get your 2 reviewers' comments, and it's like, man, this is really difficult to address. Well, we had 16 reviewers' comments at one point in order to make sure that we were validating the chronology and the history. And so we validated the history with a large group of people, and then again validated our first draft manuscript. And of course, now we are in the stage of the publication of that manuscript. Will be coming forward soon. Next slide. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of some of what we're seeing as sort of proto EE typifications. We kind of played a little bit early on whether these were actually forms of entrepreneurship education or not. And I think when we went through the review process with our 16 reviewers, we had different views on this. Some people thought, well, these proto stages really aren't entrepreneurship education. Others like, well, actually, you could define this as entrepreneurship education. So I guess there's some disagreement and some debate about these different stages. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of them. They're in the full the EEUK document in more depth than they are in our actual final paper, because we had to condense our final paper, so most of the content got removed. So the first one is the Industrial Revolution. So during the Industrial Revolution, the English civic universities were founded. So you're talking Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, a number of those civic universities were started. And most of the civic universities were started as alternatives to traditional higher education at the time. So if you went to Cambridge or Oxford, you were going to train to be in clergy, or you were going to go and be working as a politician, or a lawyer. You weren't typically going into industry. And so the civic universities were founded on the basis of this idea that we really needed more higher education specifically for industry that was developing. And at the same time, agricultural colleges were getting established. And these, particularly the civic universities, had very strong relationships with local businesses that were developing in the Industrial Revolution. And actually, as we were reading through documentation, we were finding that they were actually founded in many cases to educate the sons of merchants, industrialists, and other commercial enterprises. So we're really talking about very small numbers of people being typically educated to work in these new industrial enterprises as the second generation family owners. So we're talking about entrepreneurs. So when you look at the civic universities, they really focus on science and technology education, so science and engineering, with the focus of training second generation family business owners to become the leaders of their enterprises in what were becoming increasingly complex industrial enterprises. And so it's quite an interesting aspect to consider, that in some ways the founding of civic universities in the UK was really driven by this idea of educating entrepreneurs in engineering and science. And it would be considered at this point the first form of vocational education. It was designed for a purpose. It wasn't just education without purpose. And it was quite controversial at the time. So then we move to the industrial globalization era. So in the early, if you look at the other papers, the Academy of Management, Learning and Education, you'll see that commerce education started very early on in the US, 1820s, 1830s, also in Germany very, very early on. The UK did not have any form of commerce education until the 1890s. And so as we go through these businesses become the industrial enterprises that have been started in the Industrial Revolution, get more complicated, we have the beginning of what we call for commerce education. So this is really what we would consider today as business education, entering the UK for the first time. And this commerce education is really what I would describe as closer to international business. So you were trained in languages, you were trained in reading manuals from different technical training magazines in different languages. You had geography. So it was more of less of a business education as we would understand it, and more sort of international business education as we would consider. And during this period, again, we were before the First World War. It was very, very small numbers of students, again, typically training the sons of merchants and industrialists. So these were the third generation of family business owners, the people that were going to take over these industrial enterprises. And at this point, obviously, these companies are getting very, very much more complicated. And it was recognized that there was a need for management and commerce education to be able to manage these larger enterprises. So we go to the next page, please. So then we move in post First World War. And you've got to keep in mind that obviously large numbers of people died in the First World War, and so a large class of young and middle-aged men who were working in these companies and leading these companies passed away in the First World War. And so what we have is a shift from family businesses to public limited corporations, large companies. There's some quite significant shifts in terms of the way in which these companies are being led, and a need to train professional managers. So at this point, after the First World War, you really see a shift from what I would consider entrepreneurship education, where we're training entrepreneurs to run businesses and family owners, family businesses, to a period where we're really trying to train managers. And so from the 1920s right up to the 1970s, we're really talking about the growth of business education. So it starts off with commerce education in 1890. It shifts to industrial administration around just before the war and just after the war. Then as you get closer to the Second World War, you start to see the emergence of mathematical subjects like economic analysis, business statistics, and operational research. And then after the Second World War, there's a recognition that the UK does not have a strong management education. So two private business schools get started, Henley and Ashridge, and they're very much more sort of public administration, designed to train the sort of like the political classes, and also the post Second World War officers in management. And then obviously we get to the 1960s, and you have a significant period of university expansion with polytechnics getting started and new 1960s universities being established. Again, a rebirth of vocational education during this period and the focus on vocational education. And then importantly, two of the two new universities that were established in the 1960s found business schools at the beginning. So this is really the period where we move from a department of management or a department of operations management or industrial administration department into more comprehensive business schools that we would consider today. So you have to keep that in mind. In the 1960s, it's really only then that the traditional business schools, we understand it today, were started in the UK. And that's significantly later than the US. Also, a couple of interesting things in the data here. There was a US Marshall Grant following the Franks Report in the UK that established two new graduate business schools at LSE Imperial College, which becomes London Business School, and at Manchester. So these were postgraduate business schools. So these were the first forms of postgraduate education designed as entire schools in the UK, and they were funded by the US government through the US Marshall Grant. And then finally, we start to see management education getting on a very solid footing in the 1960s up until the early 1970s, on which we then start what we would consider our formal entrepreneurship education typifications, which then really get started in the 1970s. So hopefully that's a quick and decent overview. And I'm going to hand to David now to talk about the first typification we see in entrepreneurship education, small business management. David.
Thanks, Luke. This was a very exciting period indeed, because basically a small number of academics had been interested in small businesses, and they were really not encouraged to do so. They're not encouraged to do so by their colleagues in business and management education. They weren't encouraged to do so by the practitioners, the planners, and the economic developers. Everything was focused and orientated on big business. And it wasn't until the publication of the Bolton Report on small firms that we got any leverage or any footing whatsoever. And when this happened, we saw a massive increase in the awareness of academics in particular towards the small business. And entrepreneurship education really equated with small business education. That didn't mean to say that the opposition to small businesses disappeared. Business schools still believed that their focus ought to be on big business, multinational businesses, and that really small businesses had no purpose whatsoever in business schools. At that time, there was really a small number of professors, academics, that were dealing with this. It began to grow post-Bolton, and it began to grow once again as a result of the introduction of the Manpower Services Commission. Manpower Services Commission was supposed to be dealing with and the massive unemployment that existed in the country. And they started to run programs which were basically to improve the performance of small and medium-sized firms. So money was made available by the government to encourage the training of small and medium-sized enterprises. The big problem was, apart from the opposition, was the fact that basically there were very few people who knew how to teach small businesses, how to deal with small businesses. I remember ex-ICI directors, advising small businesses and thinking to myself, well, being a marketing director in ICI is very, very different from being the marketing manager in a small and medium-sized firm with little or no resources. So we set up a management teachers training program in 1977. And we also set up EEUK, United Kingdom Management and Research Association. Essentially, EEUK was nothing like ISB now, or any other entrepreneurship conference, in that it was extremely small. Very, very few. I think there were about 40 people at the first ever one, and dealt solely with issues relating to small and medium-sized enterprises. Not so much dealing with, preparing people for a career in an enterprise, but rather teaching people about small businesses and how they were different from multinational companies.
So David, do you think I think it's fair to say that at this point there really wasn't any use of the language entrepreneurship or enterprise education?
No. I mean, most of the professors that were appointed, people like Stanworth, Jim Curry, Alan Youb, were professors of small business. They weren't professors of enterprise or entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and then
it wasn't till another 10 years later that you started to get entrepreneurship even mentioned.
Yeah, and then the practice is, we're talking very traditional about small business entrepreneurship, small business management classes, and maybe some business planning classes and MBAs that have kind of come over from the US context. But the interest in really the adoption of business school pedagogy. I mean, we're talking, the same methods being used but applied to small businesses, and then you have the kind of like the human resources issues in small businesses, and the some of the concepts from business research being used and applied to small business. Is that correct, David?
Yeah. I mean, it was, much of, I used to eventually used to audit entrepreneurship programs, and most of them were really business studies programs with a sexy title, entrepreneurship. It was really business administration for small firms, and often it wasn't even scaled down.
Yeah, and then you see the obviously individual professors at individual universities pretty much isolated, doing their own thing, having needing to get together, which I assume is why the National Small Business Management Teachers Program got started. Did you see that as important, that development?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, even if small firms were important, and even if they were being taught in universities, who was teaching them? I mean, people like David Watkins at Manchester Business School was a specialist in small firms. Malcolm Harper at Cranfield was a specialist in small firms in developing economies. Gibby in Durham was a specialist But I mean, the vast majority of people were management educators used to dealing with large firms and simply being asked to teach about SMEs.
Great. Thanks, David. I think we should move to the next typification now. So if we can move to the next slide. So then we have the enterprise skills agenda. David is also going to talk to this one.
Yeah. Basically, the 1980s were a period of consolidation and development. We basically had small business centres being developed in our universities, led by Durham and probably Stirling in Scotland, where Tom Cannon, who'd been at Durham and worked with Alan Gibb and Mike Scott, developed a centre, and also, as I've mentioned, at Cranfield, where Malcolm Harper and Paul Burns developed a centre, and I think Sue Burley at London Business School developed centres. Interestingly, Carl Vesper did a survey of leading small business centres, entrepreneurship centres, and obviously the leading centres were in the USA. But outside of the USA, the top small business centre was in the rest of the world was in Durham, and Stirling was number 3, and I think Cranfield was around about 7th. So at that time, we were actually leading the development of small business education, enterprise education, globally. We were up with the Americans, and it was a time of extremely interesting, innovative developments. Developments not just in terms of teaching, but also in terms of research. And we saw the foundation of the International Small Business Journal. We saw ESRC funding a major research project with David Storey. And we saw began to see the emergence of small business professors and conferences and so on. So,
David, if I could just stop you there quickly. I mean, I think we would say that that period saw, for the older universities, and possibly even some of the polytechnics that would become universities at this stage, not at this stage, but later. It was really the establishment of institutionalization of small business education. So you're seeing bigger teams, you're seeing more institutions being created for like centers of small business management. You're seeing journals like International Small Business Journal, but it's still very much within the traditional educational sector, at least at the beginning of this era, a small business focus that's becoming a larger, more institutionalized thing. Is that a fair reflection?
Yeah. You see, you began to see institutionalization. I think by the end of the decade, John Stanworth wrote Bolton 10 Years On, and in it, him and Jim Curran said almost every university, every decent university had a small business centre. So that was the scale of development, the speed of development. But things also began to change, largely through the Manpower Services Commission, which, as I mentioned, had money, and they started to encourage not just small business training, but training of young people in particular, well, young people, women, unemployed, to start their own businesses. And it was the beginning of the Thatcherite era. So what we saw was the emergence of enterprise skills, and that was backed in the 1980s by a government initiative called Enterprise in Higher Education. And Enterprise in Higher Education was not about business startup, but about equipping students with enterprise skills, getting them to think creatively, think innovatively, be proactive, not wait for things to happen, but make things happen, bring about change. And it was intended for all students, not just business studies students, as had been the case previously. But once again, this attracted a lot of opposition. You know, I was at Durham at that time and responsible for enterprising higher education. And the reaction of the academics there was basically, we are not here to create Thatcherite entrepreneurs. You know, they saw this as new venture creation, business startup. It wasn't. It was about developing an enterprise culture, developing enterprise skills. However, parallel with that, new programs did emerge that were sponsored by the government. I ran a graduate enterprise program. Tom Cannon ran a graduate enterprise program. Paul Burns ran a graduate enterprise program. Alan Gibb with Shell developed something called the Shell Technology Enterprise Program, which was a 6-week program in the long vacation. And similarly at Durham, Alan developed a master's program called the Graduate Apprenticeship Program. And that was to develop in young people the.
So David, I think to sort of to move things to the next step, I mean, we're really seeing the terminology of enterprise starting to emerge, enterprise skills starting to emerge, and it's you know, also outside, not necessarily inside traditional universities at this point. You know, the polytechnics, further education colleges, private providers are providing some of these programs, and then of course, you know, the higher enterprise initiative comes along, and that starts to really kick things off in universities. So I guess we're sort of seeing a shift at the beginning of the era from an institutionalization of small business management, which still carries on, to this new typification of enterprise skills emerging, which is sort of emerging on the sidelines in other institutions. Would that be a fair reflection?
Yeah, you're beginning to get now running in parallel. You've probably got people still teaching about small business. You've got people teaching about enterprise, new venture creation, and you've got people teaching about enterprise skills.
Yeah,
but you've still got, as I suspect you've got today in higher education, a lot of opposition.
And in some of the literature, you start to see this emergence of the about for typology, where you know, obviously you still have the about small business management education going on, while education for enterprise skills is starting to emerge, and it's specifically much more competence driven, much more focused on enabling people to be entrepreneurial. Okay, I think we should move to the next slide now.
Yeah.
So then we shift into another era, and I'm going to hand over to Colette to talk about this era, this typification.
Hey, thanks, Luke. I have to say I've learned an awful lot. Working on this paper with Luke has been a real pleasure, and there's so much information out there. I think we were very inclusive in trying to gather the opinions of people and putting this together, and hopefully we've captured everything. So building on the enterprise skills agenda, sort of the next phase that we identified was one that we called small business support training for competitiveness and growth. So this typification focused on venture creation and growth, and really displaced the sort of general enterprise skills. We started to see policy and funding being introduced to support this typification. And that policy and funding was very much informed by academic thinking in terms of focusing on the quality and not the quantity of startups. So we saw also during this period a growth of provision across all forms of entrepreneurship education, which then in itself created a diversity of methods, so a diversity of pedagogies. We also saw, most notably, universities beginning to establish incubation centres. Now, this is something that very much happened in my institution, even though I'm based in the south, but we also had a link to the north. And again, that was a big trend as well. So that very much spread across the UK into the north of Ireland as well. So universities establishing incubators for graduate startups, and also through those very often launching management development programs. But again, there was a growth focus to those. We also saw degree programs being established, not necessarily focusing on entrepreneurship, but focusing very much on including some type of enterprise agenda, some type of module, again, focused on growth. So there were lots of terms associated with entrepreneurship that sort of started to become more common now, the use of the term entrepreneurship. And alongside this, we saw entrepreneurship education research beginning to grow. And that was also evidenced by the establishment of more entrepreneurship journals, amongst them the Journal of Small Business and Enterprise Development, which was established around about 94. You had a GEBRA, International Journal of Entrepreneurial Behaviour and Research, in and around 1995. And the International Small Business Journal that was mentioned previously, even though established in the 80s, that really started to take off in the 90s and became recognised as a premier journal. And again, we saw multiple typifications of entrepreneurship education starting to be acknowledged. So if we could move to the next slide.
If I can just stop you there, Colette, and I'll just ask a couple of quick questions on this one. So, I mean, I think the key thing here is that we're starting to move away from, you know, the typification of pure enterprise skills into a more focused effort on venture creation. And in some ways, that's doubled up with another typification of growth. Is that fair? It's like there's really two typifications in this one: the venture creation typification and the growth orientation typification. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. So it wasn't just any type of new venture creation. There really was a focus on it being growth oriented, and I think we saw that too in incubation centres that were running programs that perhaps might have been based on technology-based enterprise. So there are a lot of those programs around. I remember running one myself in Dundalk that was linked to one in Belfast. So there was a sense that throughout the UK and into the north, a technology focus perhaps as being evidence of the growth orientation.
Yeah, and then I think the other thing, just two other things to pick out here is there is a movement away from individual classes, and you might have a couple of small business class, a business planning class, and perhaps something that was a bit more enterprise orientated, but actually moving towards more holistic programs. There's entire degree programs getting started in enterprise entrepreneurship, and the language also is entrepreneurship rather than enterprise small business. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we started to see that term entrepreneurship being used more, and it was, somebody said earlier, you know, a sexy title. And I think there was an appeal about that word as well, that was something new and different. Yeah, I think there were, you know, more degree programs coming forward. Some of them focused entirely on entrepreneurship, but certainly almost every program that came out of a business school during that era had to have some component of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and I think this focus on the venture creation side of it in incubators and management development programs is also more practical. It's a little more focused on helping real businesses get started or develop further. And so you start to see a little bit more through practice where, you know, some of the actual education is designed to be done alongside actually doing something that is, in fact, entrepreneurship.
Yeah, that's true. And I think what also happened during that era was through the formation of incubators, there was a sense then that that was an opportunity for academics to engage much more with industry, to be doing more practical things. And again, you know, new venture creation, technology-based, all very appealing, very, very sort of sexy in those days. And it did, I think, give academics an opportunity to reach out.
Yeah. Again, as we said, not necessarily called entrepreneurship education, but certainly what we would consider an underlying typification of our contemporary practice. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so Colette, this is you again.
Okay, so then building on the earlier part of the 90s, in this sort of typification, we see university-wide entrepreneurship education. So again, you know, linked to the technology enterprise focus, you now have entrepreneurship moving out of the business schools, a sense that it had to be taught in other disciplines. Firstly, science and engineering, that seemed to be the big sort of area where opportunities might develop. Science-based programs started to include entrepreneurship. because there was a sense that there was possibly more opportunity to create a growth-oriented business out of some sort of technology-based discipline. So we saw that quite a lot, this spread of entrepreneurship education away from the business school, institution-wide. And I guess that the policies at that time aimed to move entrepreneurship education to as many disciplines as possible, right across the campus. So there's quite a growth in entrepreneurship education everywhere, very, very popular. I think some of that was probably fueled by some sort of European-wide policies that was not just encouraging, but perhaps rewarding the widening of entrepreneurship education. I think that happened nationally and at the European level. And then again, there was this interchange of ideas between the US and the UK. So I think you got more interaction between any sort of incubator or entrepreneurship center in the UK and those in the US. I think throughout the history that we've been developing in this paper, or that we've been plotting in this paper, you know, there is a US influence, and I don't think we can deny that. We then had, I suppose,
if I could just pitch in there. I mean, so we had obviously the Science Enterprise Challenge program and the Kettles and also the HEA Academy really driving that university wide agenda. And I think we definitely see you know, the influence of the Kaufman Foundation on Gordon Brown and the establishment of the NCGE, but we also see the university wide program going to the US. And being taken up by the Kaufman Foundation. So this interchange is also a two-way process. The UK university-wide agenda and the enterprise skills agenda seems to be more of a British origin of thinking that has gone outside the UK, whereas the venture creation typification is more of an American perspective that's come into the UK. I think, is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the key thing during that period was that there was a lot of interaction between the US and the UK, this exchange of ideas and learning from each other. And I think both the UK and the US had a lot to learn from each other. So yeah, that was a big thing then. And you also then saw the devolution of education and funding policies out into the regions, which was really, you know, promoting the spread of entrepreneurship education right across the country. And then, of course, it was the establishment and growth of extracurricular activities like student enterprise clubs and that sort of thing, supporting all the incubation type activities as well. So it became a growth era, not just in terms of developing from enterprise skills more to entrepreneurship, more to new venture creation, but not just any type, the focus on growth. And then this reaching out, the opportunity for universities to connect with, I guess, industry and the practice side through their incubators and the establishment of graduate enterprise programs and technology enterprise programs.
Yeah, so we saw Enactus get started for the first time, enter the UK at that point. I remember individual entrepreneurship clubs got started, and we saw the foundation of the association for the clubs, and this period is you know, really driven by significant growth across the board, across all of the typifications as well. This is the thing, it's like none of these, the enterprise skills things takes a back seat up until this point, but it's still there. The small business management, the venture creation, these typifications continue to exist while a new university-wide one comes forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of that sort of leads up to, I guess, the next era that John will talk about, which is where you know, there's this instilling of enterprise into young mindsets to try and get them to be more entrepreneurial.
Yeah, and I just want to mention one thing. The other thing that we sort of see as the proto-EE stage of science and engineering entrepreneurship sort of comes back at this point as well, because if you remember, the Science Enterprise Challenge program was designed to get entrepreneurship education embedded into science and technology programs, so there was more likely to have venture creation going on in those areas. And somewhat paradoxically, during the civic universities in England got going to train entrepreneurs with science and engineering education. So we have sort of some interconnectivity of this idea of academic entrepreneurship being driven in the original rationale for the university-wide effort in the UK through the Science Enterprise Challenge funding. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so John, over to you. Hopefully we can hear you. Okay, we can't hear you, John. I don't know if you're mute. I don't know. Have we lost John? John, are you mute? You're talking, but you're mute. Okay.
Hi, sorry, John. Yeah, I've just spotlighted John, and yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah. You can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this period, of course, is that many of the people that are working in enterprise, entrepreneurship education today, that their whole history in the field will have been developed within the last 10 years. So many of the things that are forerunners for them will not be their own personal experience. But the other interesting point about this period is that there was a change in government's role throughout the bulk of the period we've been talking about since the 1970s. We've been very influenced by what government particularly wanted and was willing to fund. My colleague Ron Downing always said to me, what you guys have always got to realize is that whatever you want to call it, what the government really is interested in is skills. And what has happened is that for a period, government provided skills and other types of advice support to small businesses. And they provided people, and some of those people came along to our relevant conferences and shared their...
John, are other people having difficulty hearing John?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right, John. We're gonna cut you off because people can't hear you properly. Let's the other members of the team. Do you want to just pitch in here and help John out a little bit? I mean, the key thing in this typification is really we're seeing the obviously this is really today. This is almost the contemporary situation in many ways, and this is during the the 2010s, which myself and David weren't even in the UK at this point. Really had this kind of phase where a lot of graduates were being produced that were maybe struggling to get graduate level jobs, and then there was a concern about reintroducing the need to help graduates start their own businesses, and so a restart of the really with the entrepreneurial skills agenda, which morphed into a mindsets and competencies approach, which is slightly different from a skills agenda, given its conceptualization of behavior, but led to this development of competencies and competency frameworks, and also the acknowledgement of many of these taxonomies. So, Colette, did you want to? You probably lived through this a little more than me and David, so maybe you'd like to add a little here.
Yeah, I'd like to say I was still at school then, but that wouldn't work with it. Okay, so I think in this period, we certainly saw, this notion of embedding skills in graduates, and it also links to what started to be called the employability agenda. And I think for me, this is the period when a lot of pressure is put on entrepreneurship, if we want to call it that, to deliver, the sort of super graduates that, the business schools are now going to be delivering enterprise skills. These graduates are going to be entrepreneurial. They're going to have these competencies that will speak to the employability agenda. And I think all of that was being placed on the shoulders of the entrepreneurship educator. There was this introduction of more competency frameworks, particularly from the EU. I think we all started to look toward the EU for different frameworks, EntreComp and different frameworks like that, and started to bring those into the classroom. So I think there was a great growth in awareness and a sort of consolidation of some of the previous typifications, but now being manifested in mindsets and competencies. And it was almost as if, whatever graduate you produce at your university, they should have an entrepreneurial mindset, because whatever organization they go into, even if they never set up their own business, they will be of huge value to existing businesses, to a range of organizations, because I think it was felt at that time that entrepreneurship was the key to problem solving. So I'm not sure if my colleagues would agree with that, but I think that was sort of the sense I was getting.
Yeah, so a couple additions. I think we should mention the role of the QAA here in terms of some of the frameworks that were developed by the QAA, and then I think also I think there's a shift here in terms of provision to careers centres as well. I think there's more evidence of enterprise education being led from administrative units such as career centres, as opposed to maybe academic units, which might have been more evident in other earlier typifications, and that certainly got going before 2010, but tended to be more dominant after 2010 period. Is that fair? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. David, did you want to add anything on this one, or should we move to the next slide?
No, I think it's an important point that, you know, that there's been a shift away from just new venture creation to actually equipping students with the enterprise skills that they will need in a world which is changing extremely rapidly. You know,
and I think it's fair to say that this is really, for us, we felt this was a re-emergence of the enterprise skills agenda from the 1980s during this period. And also, I feel like the enterprise skills, and there's a lot to be research to be done to see about the flow between different locations, like the US to UK and the UK to Europe and Europe to UK. But I feel like the enterprise skills agenda also was what's driven some of the European entrepreneurship education, the idea of trying to reinvent your culture, your societal culture into a more entrepreneurial way. They've driven that entrepreneurial mindsets and skills and competencies approach, which now is actually becoming quite popular in the US as well, interestingly. And likewise with the university-wide education moving from the UK to the US, I'm not sure all of the flow in entrepreneurship education has been from the US to other parts of the world, which is currently what the history kind of suggests. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We need to summarize and then just give everybody a chance to ask questions. So basically, we're seeing, if you put all these together into typificatory schemes, we really see four. So the first one is science and technology vocationalism. So this is idea of the university-wide, but also the history of the civic universities, this idea that we really want to engage in science and technology education, or we want to engage science and technology in entrepreneurship in order to encourage a kind of an embedded or in form of entrepreneurship education. We see the for commerce one, which is really business education applied to entrepreneurship. We see an enterprise skills typification, which is this broader, we want to change society, make it more entrepreneurial through educating people with skills, competencies, mindsets. And then finally, there's the venture creation one, which is really coming from the US and driving into the entrepreneurship education in the 1980s and 1990s, which is very much more focused on actual startups of businesses or actual support for growth businesses. There's a lot more to this, obviously, in the paper, but we need to close it this way. So at this point, so I'm not going to go into depth on these. And then I think there's one more slide. So just to kind of summarize, we see a lot of key factors behind these typifications that, obviously there are certain key pieces of academic research that change policy, and those policy developments lead to some political debates and discourse that then lead to funding. So in many cases, there is an academic, piece of work going behind it. So Birch's work, for example. But actually, what is really driving many of the changes is the money that's being driven by, policy change and political decisions. So, in general, these have been driven by concerns over the UK's industrial competitiveness, over our economic performance. It's not always been driven from the top down. Sometimes practices bubble up. I mean, if you look at things like the business model canvas and some of the venture creation practices have bubbled up from accelerators and incubators, practices that are actually going on in practice that come into entrepreneurship education from practice. Many of these typifications have been driven by external stakeholders, however. They've not been driven by the educators or the educator interests. So that is a concern looking at the history that we had, is that we're not driving, in some ways, many of these things. These are being driven by stakeholders who have money, who have interests. Often these, most of entrepreneurship education practice has been driven by for-profit businesses, by concerns over economic development or efforts to improve economic development in the UK. And it has not been driven typically by other logics, such as social or environmental logics, which is something we'll come back to. And then obviously these typifications have they kind of coexist as a patchwork quilt. They emerge at different times. They exist alongside each other. Sometimes they're more important and have more power than other times. Sometimes they are driven by other things, but they don't go away. And so this is why we have this kind of complexity that we often experience ourselves when we talk to other people about entrepreneurship education. We're like, well, I don't think they're doing the same thing that I'm doing, because there's actually different views of different certifications that are coexisting at the same time. And then there's clearly a really interesting flow going on here. We just focus on the UK, but we saw really interesting flows of concept of ideas and practices between different countries, between the UK and the US and UK and Europe. And then obviously there's interesting questions about how do those practices then flow to other parts of the world, and how do the practices from other parts of the world flow to the developed nations. So there is a really interesting, more complicated history here about the interaction between countries and regions that could be unpicked. And there's lots of other research topics here. All of these things could be looked at a lot more deeply than we do in our paper. But at this point, I'm going to stop, and I'm hoping we probably should give about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, and maybe try to condense our last half hours, if that's okay, David. So we should open up for some questions. Alison.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. You can see from the comments that colleagues have been sharing their experience, their reflections. I think we all take time to pay our respects and the debt owed to Alan. So that was something that's come through. But also our continuing frustrations with business schools and the messiness of the language and the range of agendas coming through. So David, I know you wanted to take the floor and just kind of take us more to where does this take us in the future, talking about harmonious entrepreneurship and the vision of that. So I'll throw it open to you and invite colleagues to raise their hand if they've got questions and they want to open the mic and speak, but you're welcome to add it into the question point. So David,
just for a point of reference, we have half an hour, so if we could try to create some discussion as well, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, next slide. Okay.
If I'd have drawn up this slide, I'd have turned it around the other way. What next? While I find the history of entrepreneurship education fascinating and believe it's a vitally important piece of research as a record of what has happened and how we've got to where we are, I see it very much as a platform for the future. We know where we are now. We know where we've come from, but where are we going? Or where should we be going? The world is very different from the world of the 1970s when entrepreneurship education was first introduced to the UK. We've got different challenges. We've got different problems. I'm not saying we should ditch all the things that we're doing, but we need to address the challenges that the world is facing and the UK is facing at the present time. So that's the first thing. How should entrepreneurship education change to meet the challenges of the present time? The second thing that concerns me is the fact that much of that history has been dictated to us by government policy, by funding policies. Oughtn't we, as members of an educated community, academics and support staff, aren't we to be determining the agenda about what is needed? Aren't we to be saying this is what the country needs, this is what academia and universities can provide? And aren't we to be, I have a great pessimism. I don't think we're going to find leadership, whichever government is in office, even talking about entrepreneurship. There's much bigger problems to be faced. But I believe that entrepreneurship has a role to play. And I believe that entrepreneurship should be addressing some of the problems that the world is facing. Next slide, please. And all the time that I've been teaching entrepreneurship, which is what, 40, 50 years, something like that, I've taught my students that entrepreneurship is a force for good. It creates jobs, it creates wealth, it brings about change through innovation. But at the same time, at the back of my mind has been the fact that often entrepreneurship has actually had a negative impact on both people and the planet. And how do I explain that? Equally, if entrepreneurship is so powerful and so such a force for good, why is it that we have a sustainability problem at the present time? Why is it that entrepreneurship hasn't solved that problem? And for 10 years, I was in Egypt, setting up a social enterprise, the British University in Egypt. And one of the things that I did was introduce entrepreneurship education to not just to the university, but to the country. And all the time I was doing that, at the back of my mind was this problem. Why is it that entrepreneurship hasn't addressed this issue of sustainability? When I came back in 2017, I had a store line conversion and suddenly realized that the problem was that we're dealing with a system. We're dealing with an ecosystem which is made up of an economic subsystem, an environmental subsystem, and a social subsystem. And you can't solve a systems problem one subsystem at a time because they're interconnected. And any changes you make in one subsystem impacts on the other connected subsystems. So we have to have a holistic, systemic solution to the problem. In addition to that, and I've noticed, I think it was Simon's comment, that basically we've been driven in entrepreneurship, despite the introduction of social enterprise and despite the introduction of ecopreneurship and despite the introduction of humane entrepreneurship, we've been driven very largely by Friedman's doctrine that the purpose of business is investor shareholder satisfaction and making as much money as possible, translated into profit maximization. We basically have to look at this problem as a systems problem. We have to deal with it as a systems problem, and we have to reject the doctrine that entrepreneurship is all about making as much money as possible. And with those two premises in mind, I came up with the concept of harmonious entrepreneurship. What harmonious entrepreneurship does is look at the economic problem, the environmental problem, and the social problem together and produces a business model in which profit, planet, and people are in harmony with each other, hence harmonious entrepreneurship. I then had to validate the concept and realized that in Egypt I'd actually found an organization which did that, which had turned the desert into a fertile oasis, which had built a community, which had educated the community, which had cared for the health of the community, and created a business which was an international enterprise, bringing jobs and wealth to Egyptian society. I then started to look, and we found at the present time something like 160 startup businesses which exemplify the concept of harmonious entrepreneurship. So that's what harmonious entrepreneurship is. Basically, what I'm suggesting to you is that we address the sustainability challenge. We explore not just the harmonious entrepreneurship model which I've developed, but other models, because that, for me, is the way forward. We look forward to addressing the problems of the 21st century, not the problems of the mid-20th century, or even, Luke, the mid-19th century. So really, that's all I want to say. The challenge I throw out to you is,
right,
how do we take this agenda forward?
Okay, thanks, David. And we have, let's see, we have 25 minutes for questions and discussion. I'm going to pick up a few from the chat here and there, and then if anybody wants to raise their hand, I think Alison will lead and help with that aspect. One of the first things that's in the chat, we do have. Oh, I just lost. Okay, I had the chat open. Now I've lost it. Okay, so yeah, now I just lost the chat. So the slide sharing messed me up. Oh, hold on. Hang on, I've got it back. You're good. So the first thing is that the working paper will be distributed after this. So there is an EEUK working paper, which is a much longer piece of work here that will go into a lot more of the details of this. I see Simon's been very, very busy. We didn't mention EEUK, which we should have done. So obviously, for those of you that were around in the 90s, EEUK really grew out of the Science Enterprise Challenge. So EEUK is coming out of that university-wide agenda at the very foundation of the university-wide agenda. Science Enterprise Challenge, all of those organizations got together, they created an organization, and that, I can't remember, Simon, what was it called? What was it? Was it? Oh, you're mute, you're mute.
UKSEC.
UKSEC, that's it. It was called UKSEC, and then that became EEUK. I think it went through a different name before it became EEUK at some point. So it was born during
the UKSEC title until we felt strong enough to create EEUK.
Yep. Okay. And then Colette's got her hand up. Colette.
Yeah, and sorry, I just want to make the point that we did draw on a lot of the work of the EEUK and mention EEUK quite a lot in the paper. Just unfortunate we weren't able to bring everything in the presentation, but I would urge you to read the paper because I think we've absolutely acknowledged their contribution there.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the challenges here, is that we have a very detailed chronology in the working paper, and there is a lot of detail, and each of these typificatory schemes or typifications could be looked at in a much more depth than we did in the paper. But if you go to the paper, you'll see that there's a lot of detail, and that's one of the challenges with a seminar like this. Is like there's lots of detail. Simon, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to. I don't know if you've had Alison in your pathway, then you'll have known that the transition, how the new universities got involved with UKSEC was because of the settles. UKSEC was set up around the very established, red brick universities like the ones you were talking about that were set up as municipal institutions a long time ago. The settles with enterprise and entrepreneurship embedded in them from the start allowed us to break into that club. And Alison will know that we broke into that club because of the work we were doing, and because Bob Hanscom at Sheffield and I got on well. We started being involved, and then we went across to Boston. We met with the Babson and various other institutions over there and realized, hey, we're doing better than these people in the States are doing. We need to be shouting more about what we're doing. So when we came back, we tried to engage with the UKSEC group before they lost their high funding to say we need to go and shout more loudly about what we're doing. And that's when the high funding went, we then said, look, let's not throw this away as with every other initiative that had been developed in the UK before. When the funding goes, people go on to the next funding. They chase the next funding. We said we've got something here that needed to be supported and developed. And that's when EEUK stepped up and said, well, we've got a basic membership. We can get a few bob from each university and we can be self-sustaining and we can take this idea forward. And we can create a self-help group for all the mad people that are doing stupid stuff around the universities you've been talking about, who've been marginalized and told you're not doing the right things. And that's when we created this self-help group that built our confidence, that built our networks, that then, with Andy Penaluna and all the other people's efforts, took this to where it is today.
Yeah, and I think also, if I'm not mistaken, the Science Enterprise Challenge program also required networks. So not all of the, Cambridge and Oxford, I think, got money, but everybody else, all the other ones were networks of institutions. And I know, Colette, you might have something to say there in terms of, I think it's the Northern Ireland one that was significant. That that kind of university-wide agenda wasn't just about individual universities. It was networks of universities working together as well. And so I would say that the Science Enterprise Challenge, as well as the settles, had that impact in the way that you described there, Simon, if that's fair. Okay, so yeah.
Science Enterprise Challenge was very much about building networks and in many ways complementing the partners. You know, I was involved with the Science Southeast England set squared, and you know, that was Surrey, Southampton, Bristol and Bath. You know, and they complemented each other. They worked together. If we had somebody in Surrey that we weren't specialists, we would pass them over to Bath or Bristol. So it's all about getting them to work in partnership rather than as individual institutions.
Yeah, do we? So Alison, I've got lots of questions here, but in the chat, but I want to hand to you and let you moderate. Is there anybody that has desperate questions they want to ask? If you put your hand up, we'll have Alison answer, moderate.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it is interesting. I think this probably picks up on the comment that David was making in terms of you've started to hint about the drivers. And I know that's come up in terms of whether we've been pushed and pulled by policy drivers and we're following the funding. And actually the role that we have had ourselves in shaping this agenda, and I think that's maybe David's call to arms, is that this is now with us to take things forward, and the EEUK is that sort of member voice and that educator for educator response that we're talking about, because the shift that you're referring to, Simon, in terms of the UK SEC to EEUK history is very much about other subjects saying, why is this Science Enterprise Challenge? Why is this not available to historians? Why is this not available to geographers? So actually that came from our universities and our colleagues, that drive to say this shouldn't just be for science, that's ridiculous. And that's where EEUK's kind of heart came out, is actually broadening that out. So I do think that's an important recognition in terms of those drivers. So we have, in terms of that, got a question from Rebecca's just come through in terms of the panel. So I have you all spotlighted if you wish to respond. Just saying, how can we get back to maybe a quality rather than quantity approach that we're seeing in our higher education? Because I think we're recognising, as Rebecca's hinted at here in about KPIs, recognising the league tables and the issues that we have in terms of pleasing our paymasters. So I think this is back to that agenda driven. Who's driving our agenda? Who's making us look in one direction, whether it's skills or starts? So Rebecca's question is, does the panel have any thoughts on how we can encourage institutions to get back to quality over quantity of graduate starts, given that the KPIs are looking for numbers? I'll take your response.
I'm not going to answer that one because I'm in the US and I have no idea what.
I know, I was going to say, Luke's going to take the US stance on this and not be able
Colette is the most active amongst us. Colette, do you want to take a lead here?
Well, I think there's no easy answer to this question because it's funny, I was at a conference in Amsterdam at the weekend, and again, this came up as a topic of conversation. You know, how are we measuring university performance? And a lot of it's going back to, you know, just publications and rankings and KPIs in terms of the numbers of startups without looking at the quality. And there's no easy answer. I think it's back to the entrepreneurship educators to try and platform to their institutional management about the quality of the work that they do. And it's not just the startups, because sometimes in the classroom, the modules we're teaching don't actually generate startups, but they've generated fantastic entrepreneurial teams who have perhaps generated some nice ideas that have got potential for the future, or have used their entrepreneurial competence to actually solve industry problems. I don't know if maybe John wants to say something about that. I'm sorry we couldn't hear you earlier, but you know, you were very much focused on the entrepreneurial competence side of things.
Not sure you can hear me actually.
No, it's still
I can't hear you. Sorry, you need to check your microphone, I think. I would just I want to add a little bit about the drivers here as well. I think that when we're looking at and I think this is where more research could be done on each of these typifications, because the drivers are complicated. You know, you certainly have you know, significant key academic research that makes a statement that changes the mindset, changes the conceptualization of certain things, that leads to new policy. You have things happening in the government, changes in government, changes in priorities, changes in definitions, changes in ministers that lead to new funding and new mechanisms that universities are typically chasing, so they can get money and funding and do stuff. Then you have people advocating as academics within the the implementation of that sort of funding regime to be able to ask for or change or influence practice, and that bubbles up. And then you have definite practices that come out of other domains such as accelerators and things like that also have an influence. So I think the drivers here, we've kind of picked through these a little bit. I think our biggest concern is this economic drivers. Like, we haven't really seen other factors like environmental and social drivers driving practice in the way perhaps we might want to have in the future. I think that would be the main point. I see Nigel's got his hand up. Nigel?
Hi.
Nigel, I think you're mute. Yeah, go ahead.
It's probably on mute.
Nigel, go ahead. We could hear you for a moment.
Me then.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. One thing, I totally support David's view and harmonious, etc. I'm just thinking of one thing: this elephant in the room called an election coming up, and also the dying effects of this government on trying to destroy the whole of the university sector in the UK. And then on top of that, the destruction of the LEPs, who we got a lot of money from, is another factor. These are all things that are affecting us outside without even talking about AI. And I think the effects that are going to hit us and our students and our graduates in the future are going to be phenomenal. I'm just being a bit of an old misery at that point, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, that sounds fair. I can't comment on that because I'm here and I'm dealing with Donald Trump. So, Nigel, you sorry, I can't see. I thought Simon had his own, but it's Nigel. So, Alison.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that in terms of this is actually where hopefully the power of EEUK is that we can come together. So Nigel, I hear you, and I hear the pain that we're back in the cycle of colleagues having to rewrite business plans to explain why their department should continue, colleagues losing jobs we're very aware of, and it's a feature of this current month's newsletter. So we are aware of the need for many institutions that even have enterprise in their strategy as one of their pillars in their mission statement are still having to step away because the numbers aren't big. Enterprise is not yet for all, and so that's enough of a decision for a vice chancellor to cut funding. And I think our responsibility, taking David's call in terms of what can we do about things, is actually that we need to make our case and shout more. We need to really explain the benefit that we have with our students, the transformational experience that colleagues are recognising in the classroom and outside the classroom and in workshops and as they're working with students. I think that's the work we need to do. And maybe, Luke, when you're asking about where the research should go, that's obviously been one of our continuing questions in the sector, is how do we know we're doing a good job? How do we know we're doing it right? And we know it because we see it, but actually we need to record it.
I think it's always been the problem with education, though, isn't it? How do you measure the impact of education? It's not easy to measure, and so in entrepreneurship education we have this underlying economic driver that's driving why we're getting funded, and that leads to, like, well, what impact are you having? And we have it in the US. The Corcoran Foundation came out at one point and said, we've got we've got more and more entrepreneurship education, but we're actually having fewer and fewer graduate startups, and it's like, that's a problem. We haven't been successful. This is the Corcoran Foundation, and it's like, well, no, it's not necessarily the case. It may be that there's other things going on. Like, for example, students are in a lot more debt. They don't buy houses as much these days because they don't have as much. They've got significant debt. That's a factor that you have to look at. So I think the case here would be that EEUK should start to have start to have a position about what entrepreneurship education should look like in the future, and advocate for that. Would be, I think, and I think David is onto a good kind of area, a good way to think about that.
I would endorse that, Luke and Alison. I think one of the things that EEUK could do is operate as a lobbying organisation, addressing the gatekeepers, addressing the people, the influencers, the decision makers. There's one thing addressing your membership. There's another thing addressing your opposition. And if it could be much more informative, I, I often say my job as a entrepreneurship educator is not to encourage students to start a business. It's to enable them to decide whether they want to start a business. And on some occasions, I would advise students not to start a business. I want them all to be enterprising. I want them all to be creative, innovative, decision makers, problem solvers, proactive. But they needn't necessarily go out and start a business. I haven't started a business. Well, I did have a consultancy business at one stage, but basically I'm an academic, not a business entrepreneur, because I know my own limitations and my own weaknesses. You know, I can argue for somebody else, but arguing for myself is impossible.
Sorry, David. I see Colette has a hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I just totally agree with David there. You know, it's not for everyone to be an entrepreneur, and with very good reason. And I think if sometimes we see a dip in the number of business startups, it's potentially because there's a vibrant job market, and students who have gained entrepreneurial skills feel that they would be of more benefit in industry. But I just want to touch on something Alison mentioned there, this notion about entrepreneurship for all. And I think that's maybe something that EEUK can start to promote, alongside perhaps the need for harmonious entrepreneurship, is the need for inclusive entrepreneurship. Because we talk about it being, or it should be inclusive, but we know that it's biased in so many ways. And I think that's somewhere alongside the harmonious entrepreneurship track that we could go in the future, making it more inclusive.
Yeah.
I think, you know, to give a counterbalance here, and David has a particular perspective on harmonious entrepreneurship. I know there are a number of people out there that are engaged in building social entrepreneurship programs, environmental sustainability entrepreneurship programs. It mentioned in here is the, I just spoke to in the Stockholm School of Entrepreneurship, the transforming entrepreneurship education to look at more social justice and eco-justice. So there's, you know, there is a big debate within the community, I think, to have about what form that should look, how it should be conceptualized, and maybe there will be a whole paradigm shift of different practices going on. But it's pretty clear that there has to be a shift away from a pure economic paradigm into a paradigm that is focused on environmental and social. And even for the US, I'm here looking at US, you know, North American practice, and you know, we're not seeing any of that shift at this point. We're seeing it in Europe, but we're not seeing it in North America. And so that's something that the North American universities will have to have conversations about as well. I don't think we can escape the reality that many of the ventures that our young people want to create are, or in you know, businesses that they want to engage in as students, as employees, are very much more focused on some of these issues and solving some of the problems that we face. And so I think it seems to me that there's a bit of a paradigm shift already going on, and we have to kind of have more of an open debate about what that paradigm shift should really look like and how it impacts real practice.
I know, I would like, Luke, the UK to take a leading role. You know, I said that in you know, the 1980s, Durham was the #1 outside of the USA. It isn't anymore. And, you know, I get the impression that a lot more is happening in Scandinavia, for example, than in the UK. So, you know, I think the time is right that we actually start to think about the future, the role that we're going to play, you know, how we determine the future agenda. Simon's just raised the point about terminology. I couldn't agree with you more, Simon. For me, entrepreneurship is no problem. I know exactly what it means for me, and it's not a problem. But for many people, it is. I mentioned my colleagues in Durham. We are not creating Thatcherite entrepreneurs. You know, there are people who believe that this is a political agenda. Entrepreneurship is a political agenda. I spoke to Gordon Brown when he was treasurer, you know, and said, look, entrepreneurship is for Labour, not just for the Tories. But, you know, it's very much seen as a right-wing thing. You know, the first time I ever met Andy Penaluna, was at a conference I organised in Surrey, and he attended it and said, what's all this entrepreneurship stuff? We've been doing this for years, but we don't call it entrepreneurship. You know, people are doing it, seeing its significance, seeing its importance. In many ways, it doesn't matter, you know, a rose will smell as sweet no matter what it's called, you know.
I'm getting conscious of time. We should hand over to Alison to perhaps close the seminar, and if there is any really burning questions that somebody wants to ask.
Yeah, colleagues, I was going to say I'll be bringing together the comments, and there's a quite rich discussion in terms of the debates, and I appreciate your paper contains some of the answers to some of the questions. So colleagues on the call now have that, and I'll be sending it out in the email to everybody because I know not everyone's been able to join. I would just take one sentence from each of you though, in terms of a food for thought, either a rallying cry or kind of your main point from the paper just as we close. And I will be closing with just a small advert for EEUK's future events, and obviously we hope to see you at the conference. If you've seen enough of Colette and you want more, then it'll be the place to be. So please do join us at IEC. But I'm going to just take each of you, just if you've got a comment or a sentence that you want to share, just as your parting shot as we're coming towards the end.
Yeah, I think I'll go because I know what Dave's going to say. So I'm going to go with let's you know, the Americans have written their history. I mean, it's been around for, I don't know, 20 years, the history of entrepreneurship education in the US. And I think we need to, and this is why we motivate to write this paper, the UK needs to own its own history. And yeah, this is a starting point, but I hope there are other people out there that might be interested in looking at some of the historical areas a little bit deeper and doing a bit more on this subject. We need to own our own history, and owning our own history allows us to understand our current practices better, and to think about what we need to be doing in the future in a more effective way. So I will hand to, let's go with Colette next, because David's going to close, I think.
Okay, well, first of all, it's been a pleasure being part of this session, and absolute pleasure working with the team on this paper. And just thank you, Luke, for inviting me in the first place. I'm going to go with, I suppose, supporting what David's going to say. This harmonious entrepreneurship, yes, it's getting traction in Europe. We need to make sure it gets traction in the UK. Some would call it responsible entrepreneurship, all linked to the UN SDGs. My closing point is, if we could add inclusive entrepreneurship into harmonious entrepreneurship, I would be very happy.
And I guess we close with David because we can't hear John. Sorry, John. Maybe you should type something in the chat, John.
Thanks, Luke. All I would say is I want Britain and British higher education to take the lead in entrepreneurship education, whatever we want to call it. You know, not just in the UK, but internationally. We've got a tremendous opportunity where we can actually do that, building on, you know, the history, building on what we've achieved to date, and we can move forward with confidence and self-belief. So I see a role for EEUK, see a role for ISB, and I see a role for British universities and British academia.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, with that challenge, I think challenge accepted. We're all delighted to be contributing to that debate and moving it forward. So I'm really conscious of time and appreciate colleagues are needing to leave, but we thank you for everybody's time. It's been a really rich debate, and I've committed on the chat to share any of the references, and we're grateful for anybody's shameless plug or their hints and suggestions for other reading. But you now have the working paper itself, so please dig in. This has been your kind of invitation from our panel of professors to dig in and read a bit more, get your answers, get the debate going. And I know this was sort of kick-started at IEC last year, but the debate continues, because I think Luke's point about this takes us, where do we want to go now? As Colette's saying, there's more strands to weave into our thinking to get this right. And yeah, EUK is very keen to hear from you, but we thank you all for attending. So I'm going to ask you in the traditional way to thank our colleagues. It's been a really great session. The sound of muted clapping, I can see it all online. So thank you very much. I'm going to close the recording. just take some time to pick up all the comments in the chat, but thank you very much for all your time, and thank you once again to our terrific panel and for actually doing this work for us and kickstarting our thinking in this area. So very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, everybody.
You.